Debate. The honourable member from Chatham, Kent, Leamington.
Well, good morning, Mr. Speaker, and it's an honour and a privilege again to rise in this place on behalf of the people of Chatham, Kent, Leamington, to speak on the gutting of Bill C-234, arguably one of the most contentious amendments introduced into the House this session. Why is it so contentious? Well, I opened my remarks as I usually do, Mr. Speaker. It truly is an honour and a privilege to bring the voices of our constituents to this place. In fact, the bringing of those voices of Canadians to this place is the role that all 338 of us are to do through the process of debate and committee and voting in this chamber. So it's not a throwaway comment that I make when I begin my interventions. Mr. Speaker, I'm speaking with the weight of the vast majority of my constituents and of Canadians when I speak to the amendment that restores the intent of the original C-234 to exempt on-farm propane and natural gas for grain drying and for barn heating. This amendment removes the most contentious part of the amended bill that came to us from the other place, and it reflects what Canadians want. Mr. Speaker, this was a $1 billion bill, $1 billion worth of carbon tax cost that was to be avoided with the passage of C-234. And this cost will be borne by our farmers and obviously ultimately by consumers by 2030. And the amendment brought back to this chamber by the other place, which guts this bill, would cut this relief to farmers and ultimately to consumers by $910 million, or 91% of that, according to the public budget officer. 91%. That is gutting. A recent Leger poll confirms that the vast majority, 7 out of 10 Canadians, support this exemption for farmers using natural gas and propane because there simply aren't viable alternatives for the farmers. Let's put this in perspective, please. Canada contributes 1.6% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, and agriculture only contributes 8% of that 1.6%. And so this carbon tax is only a virtue signaling exercise that drives up the cost of food. The carbon tax is a tax plan and not an environmental plan. And so I do hope that the other place, the place of sober second thought, takes note of what the will of the people is and ignores the browbeating that they received from the Prime Minister when they consider this bill a sober second time. Before going on to the significance of the bill to my constituents, I want to take note of a few observations made by the independent PBO, and that's a gagged PBO, by the way. The PBO reports that Canadians will pay, in addition to the carbon tax, another $486 million, so another $500 million in GST on top of the carbon tax by 2030. This is a tax on a tax. And in 2022, the carbon tax also costed $82.6 million just to administer. This cost was borne by 465 federal employees, and since 2019 has cost taxpayers nearly $200 million, or a fifth of $1 billion, just to administer. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to focus the remaining of my time on two industry groups that don't immediately come to mind when we're thinking about the barn heating removal of the carbon tax exemption. I'm sure my colleagues that will follow with their interventions will speak to the more traditional aspects of barn heating that are concerned in this bill. This bill is of particular significance to my riding, as Chatham-Kent-Leamington is home to 60% of Ontario's greenhouses, 2,730 of Ontario's 4,000 acres. In fact, the greenhouse acreage in CKL is larger than the entire U.S. greenhouse industry combined, making it the largest concentration of greenhouses in North America. Total farm gate represents $1.2 billion. So naturally, my constituents are gravely concerned with the consequences of the Senate amendments. Greenhouse farmers did receive an 80% carbon tax exemption in the original 2016 Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act. Why? Well, it's because they grow food, and because they recycle much of the CO2 back into the greenhouses, because as we learned in high school science, plants grow better with CO2, tax or no tax applied. But even with that exemption, Ontario greenhouse farmers will pay over $18 million in carbon tax this year, and that rises to $40 million a year by 2030. Cumulatively, Ontario greenhouses alone will pay almost $250 billion in carbon tax by 2030, and this is with the 80% exemption. But as I said earlier, Mr. Speaker, it's ultimately the consumer that pays. I know these are big numbers, and at a time of high food insecurity across Canada and the world, the gutting of C-234 is just another example of the Liberals' virtue signaling, I cannot say that this morning, virtue signaling ideology that will inflict more financial hardship on farmers and in turn subsequently on Canadian consumers. But as difficult as it is for greenhouse farmers, it's that much worse for our mushroom farmers. They did not receive any consideration in 2016, so they are paying the full carbon tax plus HST. Think about this for a moment. A greenhouse cannabis producer gets an 80% carbon tax exemption, but a mushroom farmer gets no consideration. Virtue signaling, anyone? Carleton Mushroom Farm co-owner Mike Madero summed it up best when he said, quote, "Instead of it being a staple, it's going to be a luxury item and it's going to affect sales. By affecting sales, I may have to cut back on my farm and make it smaller," end quote. Mr. Madero paid $150,000 last year in carbon tax and is on track to be out of pocket another $173,000 this year. By 2030, he estimates it will reach $450,000. This is on top of his heating bills. This mushroom farmer is an example of Canadian farm families setting the gold standard in efficiency, in innovation, and sustainability. He uses heavily insulated boilers that are powered by natural gas. Mushroom farmers in Canada will pay $7.4 million this year because of the tax, and by 2030, that bill rises to $16 million. Another mushroom producer, the one that I'm even more familiar with, is Highline Mushrooms, that operates 10 farms across Canada, and it's headquartered in my hometown. Almost all of the farms are near the U.S. border, and so they compete with U.S. producers for retailers, both in Canada and the U.S. And of course, U.S. producers, they don't pay a carbon tax, and so logically, industry expansion in this industry could very well go to the U.S. Similarly, back to the greenhouse, their industry representatives recently testified at an Ag Committee hearing, and they said that the U.S. is becoming a much more attractive alternative for expansion, this by our very own Canadian producers. This Canadian carbon tax is also directly contributing to food insecurity. Under pressure from high food prices, a 2023 Agri-Food Analytics Lab survey showed that almost half of Canadians are prioritizing the cost of groceries versus the nutrition of their groceries. Food Bank Canada backs up these figures with some startling figures of their own. Last year, food banks had to handle a record 2 million visits, and they expect another million new users this year. 1 in 10 people in Toronto are having to rely on food banks to survive. This past weekend, Mr. Speaker, I, together with the Leader of the Opposition, visited the Waterloo Regional Food Bank. They've experienced a 50% increase in usage over the past year, and a 5-fold increase in the past decade. That shouldn't happen in Canada. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, Conservatives have introduced an amendment to reject the Senate amendments and demand that the bill be passed in its original form. That to support our farmers, our families. When you tax the farmer that grows the food, you tax the trucker that delivers the food, you ultimately tax the Canadian consumer that consumes and buys the food. I call on our NDP and Bloc Québécois members to hold to their original vote on this bill and reject the Senate amendments. It's high time that the government puts aside its ideological agenda and do what's best for Canadians, as the Canadians are calling for. Or better yet, step aside and let Conservatives restore hope and sanity to this country, uniting our country and our home. Your home, my home, Mr. Speaker, our home. Let's bring it home.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bravo.
Député.